The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on The Agenda, John Michael McGrath and I with our weekly onpoli podcast.
This may end up being one of those kinds of races where anything could have shifted the margin of victory, but certainly Gaza could be one of those big issues.
Absolutely. Okay, JMM, normally we talk a little bit about our wardrobe off the top, and I still want to stay with the wardrobe theme, but not our wardrobe.
No, we have a little bit of news. The onpoli family got a little bit bigger this week. Our intrepid producer, Matthew O'Mara, is a new father. And so instead of talking about our clothes, we have this delightful onesie.
Show it to your camera.
Oh, sorry. There we go.
Look at that.
Good things grow in Ontario, and we are very, very happy for Matthew and his family. He's going to be off for a little bit, and we will try not to burn the place down with our incompetence without his supervision.
In his absence, yes, indeed. Good things grow in Ontario is, of course, that's the slogan of the
Ontario Foodland.
You know, it's the agricultural sector.
There's a jingle through.
Good things grow in Ontario. There we go.
There we go.
Okay, stop me before I sing again. On to issue one. The keffiyeh. Is it merely a cultural item with centuries of roots in the Arab world, or does it make a more political statement and is therefore worthy of banning at the Ontario legislature? Well, at the moment, it's definitely the latter, as a second attempt to unban the keffiyeh failed to achieve the unanimous support required at Queen's Park earlier this week. Let's take a look at what transpired.
Of course, a decision that was made by the Speaker. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, I'll continue on. We have amongst us the most diverse caucus in the history of this province.
This House stands in recess for 15 minutes.
Okay, that's some of the action at Queen's Park this past week. I suspect for those people who are coming late to this issue, they are wondering, what is this all about anyway? So can we go back to when this first hit the headlines and maybe give us some of the background here?
Right. So we talked about this a bit last week. Speaker of the House, Ted Arnott, has banned the keffiyeh from being worn at Queen's Park. Neither MPPs nor private citizens visiting the legislature or political staff are allowed to wear the keffiyeh on the grounds that it constitutes a political message in the context of current events in the Middle East. There's a long-standing rule at Queen's Park and in other parliaments and legislatures that you're not allowed to bring props or wear clothing that express a political message. You can't, for instance, wear a shirt with a slogan on it, whether you're an MPP or a guest. The ban, when it was realized, it kind of seems to have snuck up on some of the party leaders, but when it became public knowledge, all four leaders of the main political parties at Queen's Park all announced their opposition to the ban. That includes both the Premier and NDP leader Marit Stiles. Not that many issues that they agree on wholeheartedly. Mm-hmm. It is possible to modify this kind of a rule at Queen's Park, and the official opposition leader Marit Stiles did try to do so last week with a unanimous consent motion. As the name implies, it needs to be unanimous with all the MPPs present, and they have not been able to get that so far. We talked about this last week. MPP for Eglinton Lawrence, Robin Martin, was a no vote in the unanimous consent motion last week. And so that attempt failed.
She has not been the only no vote, but she has been certainly the most prominent no vote. She did send out a statement earlier this week explaining her position on the ban because she is getting some pressure to sort of fall into line and vote as the majority of the members in the House would want. But here's what she said earlier this week. The rules of the legislature are clear that props and clothing that make a political statement cannot be worn in the chamber. To agree to a motion similar to the one put forward last Thursday by MPP Marit Stiles, which declares the keffiyeh to be a cultural symbol and not a political one, would be to deny the fact and reality that it has taken on an inherent political meaning, particularly at this time. That's Robin Martin, MPP Eglinton Lawrence, who, as I say, was a prominent no, but not the only no. There were, it sounded like a good handful of people who voted no last time.
I think the count among the press gallery is something like 4 or 5 MPPs in the second attempt to say no.
And MPP Martin has said that she accepts any political repercussions for her continued stance. The suggestion here being, of course, that, the Premier's office might want to punish her for being offside from the majority of the caucus. And if that's the case, she says, so be it. Now, the guy at the center of all of this is, of course, the Speaker of the Legislature, who most of the time nobody ever notices or thinks about or talks about, because his job there is to sort of keep order and make sure the place runs smoothly. But Ted Arnott is really in the eye of the hurricane here. How come?
This is his job. Unfortunately for him, I guess in this context, if you're the Speaker, most of the time you don't want to make the news. And unfortunately for Ted Arnott, now he has. But I'm going to zoom out for a second here. There are a bunch of rules at Queen's Park. This is not the only one that structure what is and is not acceptable debate for MPPs. We inherit them mostly from the British parliamentary tradition. And the general idea, if there is a common thread to all of them, the general idea is to keep debate civil, to keep the debate going when necessary, and to keep it limited to words and not say fists. There are real historical reasons for these rules, and folks with a more international bent can look up legislatures in other countries where brawling is still a semi-regular occurrence. It makes for some interesting YouTube viewing, but if you're worried about a search history at work, maybe don't. So that is why there is a rule against wearing political slogans on clothing or any kind of props in the legislature. It is the Speaker's job, to get back to Ted Arnott, to enforce the rules of the House and keep the debate civil.
Having said that, and let's put this on the record again, I know we've said this before, but it bears repeating, honorable people can disagree on this subject. There are defensible arguments on both sides. For example, there's certainly a view that no one seems to have a problem if MPPs show up, for example, wanting to wear flags for Ukraine or ribbons in the colors of, blue and yellow for the Ukrainian people. Apparently, that is not a problem. People do that, and it's fine. They're in the middle of a war over there, so there's certainly an aspect to a political statement about that, but that one goes through. Apparently, the CAFA, however, that's a bridge too far at the moment, and some would suggest that that is effectively discriminating against Muslims or Arabs. I don't know. What do you think? Fair criticism?
I think it is a fair criticism. This is a judgment call intrinsically, and the Speaker, Ted Arnott, again, honorable people can agree or disagree, and I think Ted Arnott might have gotten this call wrong, but I do want to emphasize the critical point here that, you and I have been around long enough. There is a history of speakers sometimes turning a blind eye to things that they don't really want to have to weigh in on. This was not possible for Ted Arnott in this case because an MPP brought it to his attention. And the ability of a speaker to see or not see, or to weigh in on an issue or not weigh in on an issue, it becomes impossible for him to ignore it.
However, keep going.
Well, we do know that Sarah Jama, the independent MPP for Hamilton Centre, was wearing a keffiyeh in the legislature on Tuesday, and pictures made it onto Twitter. And Arnott was asked, "Hey, I mean, what is going on with this rule if Sarah Jama can be in the House wearing the keffiyeh?" And he said, "I actually didn't see it." And for our audience, that's not implausible because the independents in the chamber sit at the farthest possible end from where the Speaker sits. And it's, I've been in that chamber from the reporters' rooms. It is actually possible to miss things like that.
There's no question. There are blind spots in the House. And, even though the Speaker sits a few steps up and has a pretty good view of the entire seating array of 123 other MPPs, because he's one of them, I guess the reality is, if you're sitting at the far end of the back row, it's possible to miss it.
Yeah, I think so. And that seems to have happened this week. And we will see how this continues to evolve. I don't know at the moment if the New Democrats are going to try and go for a third attempt to try and reverse the ban. There seems to be no real push from the Premier's office. I mean, you mentioned Robin Martin being willing to accept any kind of political punishment. There doesn't seem to be any appetite in the Premier's office to try and punish either Martin or the other, let's call them dissident MPPs.
Mm-hmm. Now, there is another angle on this story, and that is that there's a by-election, of course, coming up. Two of them coming up on May the 2nd, one of them in Milton. And the reason we're looking at Milton is because I think according to the last StatsCan census, a quarter of the residents in Milton are Muslim, and they might have a particular interest in this issue. The Liberal candidate in that race has posted and then taken down a video saying that if you care about Gaza, you got to vote for him because he's your voice on that issue. I can't swear that this is the case, but I suspect this is the first time that events in the Middle East may play a factor in the outcome of a by-election in the province of Ontario. So, and in fact, we've had one columnist, I think it was Brian Lilley of the Toronto Sun, yes, who weighed in saying to the Liberal candidate, you know, kind of shame on you. This is an Ontario by-election. The war in the Middle East shouldn't have a role, and you're trying to make it something here is inappropriate. That was Lilley's take. Anyway, it's supposed to be super close there. What are the polls saying?
Right. So the most recent poll that I've seen as we record this is from Main Street Research, and they are suggesting that it's really a two-candidate race at this point between the Liberal, you mentioned Galen Naidoo-Harris, and the Progressive Conservative, perhaps now a Progressive Conservative, Zia Hamid.
Now, why do you say that?
I joke because, of course, he does have a history of both supporting the Liberal Party as well. Regardless, they are within a percentage point of each other, according to this Main Street Research poll, and so a very tight race. This may end up being one of those kinds of races where anything could have shifted the margin of victory, but certainly Gaza could be one of those big issues.
Absolutely. And with that, let's move on to issue 2. Well, the big news in the electric vehicle sector continues in Ontario as Honda has announced it's going to build a massive new auto assembly plant in Alliston, about an hour north of Toronto. JMM, what do we know?
So Honda has had a presence in Ontario for decades now, but this will be the largest investment, is being billed as the largest auto investment in Ontario's history. $15 billion for 4 major new assembly plants. The Alliston plant already makes, I believe, the CR-V and the Honda Civic. These are some of the company's best-selling vehicles.
You wouldn't know because you don't have a car.
No. But there was some concern among the workers there that there was not a production commitment after, I believe, the end of this year. And obviously today's news, very good news for the workers who are wondering about their future. The deal announced this week is not just for new vehicles in that assembly plant, but also 3 more facilities, both for batteries as well as 2 facilities for battery components. So not just the cars, but really much more of the full EV supply chain. So we're talking about the Alliston plant that will manufacture 240,000 EVs per year. The battery manufacturing plant, which will produce 36 gigawatts of batteries per year.
Sounds like a lot.
It's giga usually denotes a lot. Then there is a cathode material plant. Cathodes are a part of any battery system that you need to have. And then a separator facility. I confess here, I don't know the role of a separator in a battery, but I believe it's important. And that the location for that specific factory, both of those battery component factories, we don't know the exact location of those, but somewhere in Ontario.
The whole point is it's the whole supply chain, basically. You got it all in one spot.
Exactly,
yeah,
yes.
Okay. Lots of money going into this, obviously. I think the feds, $2.5 billion. Ontario, $2.5 billion. They're putting in their share. There's tax credits. There's
a relative steal compared to how much it has cost us to land other plants like VW and Stellantis.
Don't say that too loud. They may want more. Anyway, no, the government has certainly put in, both governments, federal and provincial, put a lot of effort into wooing automakers here, not just to land the assembly jobs, but also the whole supply chain. You know, almost everybody's here. So I guess it's worth asking the question, does a huge investment like this vindicate all of the subsidies that both levels of government are offering?
Well, you know, it's early days still, but I would say this is certainly evidence in the government's favor. We have talked about this on the podcast before, but, you know, the vision that the government has laid out, and, you know, this has come from the Premier, from the Finance Minister, others in Cabinet, is that basically the electric vehicle boom will not just generate manufacturing jobs in southern Ontario, but the need for critical minerals, for those batteries will drive mining and processing jobs in northern Ontario as well. You really, you hear provincial politicians talk about this all the time of tying the north and south together with this auto investments. And this, of course, is just mentioned. This is not the only auto investment we've seen in the last few years. We have VW and Stellantis. But it's also, we've seen reports of, mining companies exploring new mineral plays in the north, and even some very long idled, processing facilities like cobalt have attracted interest for reopening those. So there seems to be something happening.
It's huge, and it's a huge bet as well. I mean, the reality is our respective governments right now are making a bet that electric vehicles are the future and will be the future for a long time. That something else like hydrogen-powered vehicles or solar-powered vehicles are not going to come along and take over. So this is our bet. Let's hope it comes off.
Well, and it's important that you say that because, not all automakers have embraced battery electric vehicles at the same rate. Tesla obviously has only ever been an EV maker. Ford and GM have some notable EV models. Honda and Toyota are this interesting case. They have gotten relatively late into the EV game. Toyota, particularly, they had a longtime CEO who was actually very hostile to the idea of EVs. Toyota was much more bullish about hydrogen, that you mentioned. Honda, in particular, does seem to have pivoted in the last year. Their CEO told Bloomberg again last year that the company is trying to make up lost ground. So from an Ontario perspective, it's very interesting to me that part of their EV catch-up plan, if you want to call it that, seems to focus on building a really major operation here in Ontario.
Mm-hmm. Do we know why they made this pivot?
From other reporting, it does seem like one of the reasons that the company is shifting its perspective is the success of very cheap Chinese-made EVs succeeding in global markets. There's a lot of say consternation in Europe right now about how quickly some Chinese automakers are succeeding there. If our listeners haven't heard the name BYD yet, it is the largest EV maker in the world by some metrics. And one of the stories I think of the next decade that we probably will all be keeping an eye on is how established automakers like Honda, but also like Ford and GM, how they are going to square off against Chinese imports. That has not been a big part of the story here in Canada yet, but I would not be surprised if we see more of it coming soon.
And I'm betting you're right about that. And with that, it's off to issue 3. In 2018, the Ontario Liberal government, led by Premier Kathleen Wynne, created the Ontario Basic Income Pilot Program. It provided money with no strings attached to 4,000 Ontarians in the following cities: Hamilton, Brantford, Thunder Bay, and Lindsay. And evidence showed that a significant chunk of recipients saw their lives improve. They went back to school to upgrade their skills. They acquired better housing. Their diets improved, and therefore they were healthier. But a year into the program, the Liberals lost the election, and the Ford Conservatives quickly canceled it. Fast forward 5+ years, and there is now a class action lawsuit launched by participants of that basic income program who say the Ontario government broke a contract with them when they nixed the program. Okay, JMM, you went to the announcement this week. Tell us more.
So the news in this case is that the class action lawsuit has been certified and is going to be allowed to proceed after a few years of being fought in court by the Ontario government. That's important because any class action lawsuit has to first prove to the court that there's at least some chance of success, and the government argued that it should be dismissed outright. Lots of class action lawsuits don't clear this threshold and simply get dismissed. So it's notable that it has been certified, but it is not a victory in itself for the participants in the basic income pilot. The Ontario Superior Court has ordered the government to pay $320,000 in legal fees to the plaintiffs so far. They are seeking in total $200 million in general damages. And I just want to reemphasize, the case as it stands right now does not do anything more than just let this case proceed to a more complete hearing. They have not won the argument in court yet.
I'm going to preempt you saying, well, I'm not a lawyer, but, okay, we know you're not a lawyer, but tell us, what are the essential arguments that the plaintiffs are making?
The arguments that they are making is that they had a contract with the Ontario government when they signed up for the basic income pilot. And that the government breached that contract when they canceled the program so soon after winning the election. Many participants, as you discussed in the intro there, they made financial plans about their lives around the 3-year program, and those plans either had to be paused or simply abandoned when the program was canceled.
Now, as we often do here, we like to get people the background because for, I guess, many of our viewers and listeners, this will be a new story to them. So let's go back in time a little bit. This program was started as a test case by the Kathleen Wynne government in order to do what?
The idea was to test whether a simpler form of income support led to better outcomes than Ontario's current set of programs like Ontario Works and the Ontario Disability Support Program and others. Anybody who's ever had to navigate the current system of income supports, there are lots of different programs that can get quite complicated. And they are also, at the risk of editorializing, they are also kind of meager, and they come with strings attached. With OW and ODSP, there are earned income clawbacks. On the topic of income clawbacks, we will at least mention out of fairness that the PC government did substantially increase the threshold for that income clawback. So you can earn a certain amount of money before the government starts taking your income support away. To participate in the basic income pilot, you had to be a low-income earner. In the program, you would get about $17,000 a year, and that money was projected to continue for 3 years. That was the length of the pilot program. As you say, people used that money for education, to pay bills, transportation. Some planned to start new businesses, kind of thing that a progressive conservative government might want to encourage. And in some cases, it was just, buying better, higher quality food for themselves and their families.
Yeah, I do remember interviewing one woman who was a recipient of the basic income pilot who I think had 3 or 4 giga jobs.
Yes.
And she said by being on the basic income, she could afford to give up one of these giga jobs and use that time to go back to school and, improve her talents. So, okay, that obviously didn't happen anymore, or put her in a difficult financial situation when the pilot got canceled. I think it's worth making this point. Whether you liked the program or whether you didn't like the program, whether you thought in the long run we could afford it or we couldn't afford it, one of the things that people have pointed to was the, in their judgment, unfairness of canceling a program just 1 year into a 3-year test before the government really had a chance to get back any information about how well or how poorly it was working. How significant an angle is that in their legal defense?
It's extremely important because the people who signed up for this pilot, it wasn't just a matter of punching your name into a website, giving the government your address and hoping for the best. Maybe they'll pick me, right? There was substantial documentation that they had to fill out because it wasn't just about receiving the money. It was about participating in the research project itself. And anybody who's ever been part of a research project, there's all sorts of ethical paperwork that you have to fill out and consent forms and these kinds of things. And again, the point wasn't just to give people money. It was to determine whether the outcomes were better than the status quo. And we never got the scientifically rigorous answer that we were hoping for out of the basic income pilot because of the cancellation. But the sheer volume of paperwork that was involved for these participants is part of their agreement that there was, in fact, a contractual relationship between the province of Ontario and the participants.
There is something about this program that is cursed. Because I think it was 50 years ago, they tried to do it in Manitoba. Yes. An NDP government brought it in, and then before the program could run its course, a Conservative government kicked out the NDP government, and they canceled it right away. So we missed that opportunity. And now history has repeated itself in Ontario half a century later. I wonder if this is ever going to happen anywhere.
Well, and there is, in fact, an argument that while we don't have the kind of information that you would want in Canada from a Canadian-specific pilot, that there have been other pilots in other jurisdictions, and there is an argument that actually we don't need a pilot anymore to make the basic decision about whether this works or not. That is a larger argument that I don't think we're going to wade into on this podcast today.
Any other things you want to add about this?
There is one other thing, but I'm going to save it for the Your Column, My Column segment.
You are, because you wrote about this week. Very good. All right. And in that case, on to Your Column, My Column. All right, it is time now for a regular feature that we like to call Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns we wrote for TVO.org over the past week. And I don't have to ask you what you want to talk about because you've already told us. Fire away.
Right. So I did write about the basic income class action this week, but rather than go over everything we've already talked about, I did want to draw our listeners and our viewers to one specific point here. Steve, do you remember the controversy about a decade ago now about the Slots at Racetracks program?
The answer I should give you is yes. But the honest answer is I vaguely remember it had something to do with revenue sharing with slot machines. And if the horse racing people didn't get that, they were in desperate financial straits.
Right. So the government was splitting the revenue from slot machines with racetracks. And as people will remember, in 2011, 2012, the government was this is the Liberal government of the day, was facing a huge deficit. It was looking for ways to keep more money from the regulated gambling sector here in Ontario, and they decided that they were going to keep all of the proceeds of the Slots at Racetracks program. It was a huge cut in the funding for the horse racing industry, and it happened effectively overnight. Hugely controversial all over Ontario, communities where racetracks were a major employer. Like with the basic income pilot, it led to a lawsuit, not from the racetrack operators themselves, who had an agreement with Ontario Lottery and Gaming, but from the people who owned and bred racehorses. It takes years to breed and raise a racehorse, right? They argued that they had made huge investments in their horses based on the expectation that revenue sharing program would continue, and that when the government canceled it, there was effectively a breach of contract. Now, the horse breeders won their lawsuit in 2020. And we are going to remind listeners once again that I am not a lawyer, but I did speak to the lawyer who's representing these participants in the basic income pilot, and I had to ask him, is this a relevant precedent? And he did not call me stupid.
Can I offer an opinion here?
Yes.
It's always a beautiful thing when a source says you're not being stupid.
Yes, truly, it does make you think that you've actually learned something. So the lawyer, Stephen Morrow, said it is actually an important case for them because, if anything, the pilot participants actually have a much clearer contractual relationship. There is actually paperwork between them and the government of Ontario, and that's something that the horse breeders didn't actually have in practice. Now, this is going to continue to play out in court over probably the next year at least, maybe several years, but I do want our listeners to remember this little bit of trivia. If this class action suit gets decided because of a precedent involving horse racing, you heard it on this podcast first.
Excellent. Well done, JMM. That's terrific.
And what about yourself, Steve?
Well, okay. I am actually working on a somewhat more complicated column right now, which is going to take at least a couple of weeks to write. So I did not have a column last week. And under normal circumstances, I would give you a bit of a tip on what I'm working on right now. But I'm not going to spill the beans on any of it because there is the possibility that some journalists from competing stations or newspapers or whatever are watching this right now. At least I'd like to think so. And I don't want them to steal this very neat idea. So suffice to say, mum's the word for now, but stay tuned.
I am waiting in anticipation. In the meantime, let's go to the mailbag.
All right. If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we always love to hear them. Send it along to onpolitics@tvo.org. And JMM, since we're running a little long, how about one letter this week?
Sure. This week we have a question from listener Theodoros Senidis in Toronto, specifically on the Danforth, who writes, "Hello, JMM and Steve. Love the new video format. I've always cherished memories of riding the Scarborough RT.
Ah, yes.
Have either of you had the opportunity to experience it? I have, in fact. Initially planned for streetcars, the Scarborough RT saw a significant transformation under Bill Davis's government with the creation of the Intermediate Capacity Transit System. Serving Scarboroughians faithfully for 4 decades, it became an integral part of the community's transportation landscape. Now, with the recent decommissioning of the Scarborough RT, I find myself reflecting on its enduring legacy. What do you believe will be its lasting impact? And when considering the broader context, do you view the RT as a positive or negative legacy of the Bill Davis era? Thanks, Theo."
Theo, great question. You know, you're always going to get brownie points with me, Theo, when you ask questions related to the Bill Davis era
It's
of
like
Ontario.
Bill Davis and transit. It's like perfectly made for the two
For
of us.
both of us, indeed, yes. Well, like my friend John Michael here, yes, I have also taken rides on the old Scarborough RT, and like most transit projects, I think it's fair to say it had its pluses and its minuses. On the plus side, it was quite ahead of its time when it debuted 4 decades ago. It also provided a lot of jobs. It was a Crown corporation. I think it was called UTDC, Urban Transit Development Corporation, and it was headquartered in Kingston. So there were a lot of jobs building rail cars, transit cars in Kingston that I'm sure the good burghers there appreciated. Now, on the downside, when it was wintertime, and remember, it was a subway that didn't go underground. Yes. It was like an above-ground subway.
It's exposed to the elements.
Exposed to the elements is a great way to put it.
Yes.
And the tracks would ice up. Yeah. And the trains could get stuck when it got icy or really cold, which did provide for some inconvenient moments. But with the loss of the RT, and it closed last September, Scarborough is really without the transit it needs because the new subway, which of course multiple politicians have promised to build, is still at least a decade away from being built. I hasten parenthetically to add that if they'd just gone for an LRT, which would have been cheaper and faster to build, they would have it already by now probably, and it would be carrying people and encouraging housing and other development. But politicians knew better, and therefore they insisted on a subway, and so Scarborough will, for another decade, be without its RT, it will be without an LRT, and it will be without a subway. So it's all buses and cars right now, and that's the way it's going to be for another decade. Am I getting off on a bit of a tangent here? Maybe I am. Anyway, come on in here and rescue me.
I'm certainly going to co-sign much of what you said. I have a lengthy record of opinion pieces at TVO, and even before I started working here, where I think the theme you could say is that I don't believe the people of Scarborough have been well served by their leaders on this issue. The issue of the SRT, arguably an example of a 1970s case of not invented here syndrome, where Bill Davis wanted to really nurture a made in Ontario solution. And, the hope was that it would become the kind of technology that we could sell to other jurisdictions and really be a growth industry. That unfortunately never really panned out, although it is the backbone of Vancouver's mass transit system. So that's not nothing. Right now we're talking, or there's definitely been some chatter about, turning that elevated SRT right-of-way into something like the High Line in New York, like an elevated park that people could walk. I don't know, frankly, the details of how realistic that is, whether that's cheap or easy or possible. This is just one of those cases where I just don't know the details of the proposal, but I would certainly love to see some reuse of that if possible. And because we did mention the Intermediate Capacity Transit System, the ICTS acronym, I do have to always mention this old joke that I heard from TTC hands once upon a time. You mentioned how it did not perform well in cold. The joke was that ICTS stood for It Cannot Traverse Snow.
People in the TTC are in glass houses on this one. They should be careful, because you know what they sometimes say the TTC stands for?
What's that?
Take the car. So yes. They got to be careful there.
All right. As you say, just one letter this week. But again, if you would like to ask any questions about content on the show, you can always email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this April 26th, 2024. Until next Friday, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Chris, as a general principle, do you think it is a good idea to reward companies and people who pollute less and make it more burdensome for companies and people who pollute more?
Are you talking about the industrial carbon tax or the consumer carbon tax? Because what we're tackling head on is the consumer carbon tax that people are paying to heat their homes, to drive to work, and to paying more for groceries. For example, farmers have to pay the carbon tax on natural gas that they use to heat their barns, so to keep chickens alive in minus 30 degrees all year round, okay? And to truck food to people. So if you say you're a trucker and you're filling up your big rig, to fill up those 2 diesel tanks now is going to cost you an extra $200 just in the carbon tax charge. This is helping to contribute to the increased cost of everything. Now, there are other ways to skin a cat. Why aren't folks talking more about capturing CO2 as a waste element instead of trying to tax people to death?
All right, let's go there right now. Let's go there right now. Stuart, the carbon tax and rebate policy is obviously one option of a number of options that the federal government considered before landing on the carbon tax and rebate. In your view, might there have been a better, more politically saleable option out there?
Well, so carbon tax and rebate, and it's important to put both halves of the equation, right? Because what Chris hasn't mentioned is that the average family in Ontario is going to get more than $1,000 back this year as a rebate from the carbon price. In Alberta, it's more like $2,000. That's a lot of money back. And it offsets, for most families, what they're paying in carbon price. Chris and I can debate, whether or not it completely offsets it. For some families it does, for some it doesn't. The parliamentary budget officer says the same thing. Some families come out ahead, most break even, particularly the highly wealthy families pay a bit more.
No,
the big
he said
point,
most
though,
don't,
is,
actually.
this is where what I want to hear from Chris is this, right? So there's a letter that came out a couple of weeks ago from 420 economists across Canada saying carbon price is driving down emissions and it is the lowest cost way to reduce emissions. So Chris, you may know something that most of Canada's economists don't know, but I want to hear from you. If you don't want to do it with carbon pricing and it's achieving about 40% of our emission reductions, how would you get that big chunk of emission reductions? You talked about capturing CO2, that'll get you 2 or 3% of it. So yeah, we should do that, and we are doing it. The government has put in place tax incentives. So there's a number of things. Carbon pricing isn't the only policy. We've brought in phasing out coal power, one of the biggest emitters in the world. We brought that down. We're moving towards electric vehicles. We're reducing methane emissions from oil and gas. We're working on home energy efficiency and heating. The government is doing a number of different things, building codes, but carbon pricing is the centerpiece of it, and it's going to get us about 40% of the emissions we need to meet our global target.
Okay, let's let Chris speak to that.
Pricing, what do you want instead, Chris? How would you, if you're committed to reducing emissions, and you still haven't answered that question, if you're committed to it, what would you do instead to get that 40% of emission reduction?
Do I need to have an economics degree in order to answer this question?
I hope not.
I sure hope not. Because I just wanted to really frame that, okay? Because average working people are struggling right now. We have record numbers of people.
But how would you reduce the emissions, Chris? How would you reduce them? If you don't use carbon pricing, what would we do instead? Or do you not care about reducing
for example, we have private companies that are capturing CO2 as an element in the air. Okay, they're taking it from the air and they're reusing it for things like fertilizer, pharmaceuticals, even vodka. Even the blue dye that goes into M&Ms is used from captured CO2. So why don't we let private companies actually capture this as an element instead of taxing average working people for the sin of heating their home and buying food and traveling around this big, cold country? So I just wanted to very, very firmly, excuse me, please let me finish. The parliamentary budget officer did two different calculations, okay, in that report. One of them was the simple cost for cost. So say you're Monica in Mississauga, you're filling up your tiny hatchback. You're spending about $6.50 extra in the carbon tax. Now, based on that first calculation, you might get that fully back in a rebate. Fine. But what the parliamentary budget officer also did was calculate the economic impact of that carbon tax for Monica. That includes her home heating, and that includes everything being more expensive because of the cost on trucking and the cost on farmers. Now you're out money. So I think it is important for us to look at the entire picture of the cost of the carbon tax in Canada before we start saying that you're made whole or better off. By this logic, keep in mind, if people generally, or in the majority, are made richer by having a higher carbon tax, why don't we make it $500 a ton? Everybody would be super rich. That's nonsense, okay? Everybody with common sense understands that that doesn't make any sense. People, on average, are out money because of the carbon tax. Further, if they weren't out money, two things. Why did Prime Minister Justin Trudeau make a carve-out for home heating oil for folks in the Maritimes if it wasn't really a financial burden? And two, where's the stick then? If people are magically getting carrots in their inbox all the time, in their bank accounts, because the carbon tax rebate makes them all rich, then where's the incentive to switch to something that actually doesn't exist for them?
Kristen, I'll put you to work first right away. You obviously watch this as the AG critic for the NDP. What's going on in our provincial justice system today that's got you so concerned here?
It's not just myself that's concerned. Many legal observers have expressed the same concern. And essentially what we're seeing is a historic high backlog in cases, taking an extraordinary amount of time to get to trial. And we're also seeing a chronic underfunding of the court system, meaning that it's not adequately staffed. We have sometimes courtrooms going dark, courtrooms not being used a maximum number of optimal hours. And most significantly, for the general public is that we're seeing violent offenders sometimes walking free. So that means sexual assault cases, as we know, charges are being stayed or withdrawn, and simply trials are not happening in a timely fashion. So all of this is leading to quite a bit of chaos. And I would say that the legal observers are now starting to call it a crisis, and I would tend to agree.
Let me get Kate to follow up on that. Why is this issue so critical right now, Kate?
It is critical for everyone because it can happen to anyone. I was nearly murdered July 31st, 2021. My abuser was subsequently charged 8 times, and all 8 charges were stayed 2 times. There was 5 charges in the provincial court and 3 charges in the federal court. So that result is completely abhorrent because now my abuser is free in Leaside and free to do this again to someone else without a single consequence. It's terrifying. It creates a very unsafe culture. And unfortunately, given my experience after speaking out about this, thousands of people have reached out to me and hundreds of victims with the same story. So I am not unique. I just want to be a conduit for change, and we need to change this, because it is so unfair to innocent civilians and unfair to the victims and their families.
Kate, let me do a quick follow-up here. Did you get an explanation as to why your case ended the way it did?
The Attorney General, I wrote to them. I had to write to them. Well, we didn't have time to prosecute it. His Chapter 11B rights overstepped yours, essentially. So his rights outweighed mine this entire time, though I was the victim of attempted murder. And I mean, for my attempted murder, we have it on video. We have pictures of him doing this. We have me in the moment after the SWAT team, if you will, came to my house and found me in pools of my blood that night. And it still doesn't matter. My family hired a high-profile criminal attorney, and it still doesn't matter. It's not a matter of resources. It's a matter of criminal rights outweighing victims' rights. And Canada isn't safe.
It's a good thing we've got a lawyer here, because I think Kate just mentioned something that we need some explanation around. Chapter 11B rights and this kind of thing. What's she referring to?
Sure. In the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms under Section 11B, every Canadian has the right, if they're charged with a criminal offence, to have a trial within a reasonable time. And the way our Supreme Court of Canada has looked at that is they've said that this is, well, it's a right that belongs to the accused person in a sense. It's also a right that belongs to the public and the whole Canadian community. Because when that right isn't enforced properly, what we see are massive backlogs. The current timetable is about 2.5 years to get to a trial.
For what kind of case?
For a serious case, for an indictable offense, being a reasonable amount of time. And without those kinds of limits, we can start to see backlogs of 4, 5, even 6 years. This has happened historically, which is a bad outcome for everyone involved in the justice system, including victims, their families, witnesses, and the accused person.
Okay, going to do a follow-up with you too, Stephanie, because the case we hear about all the time is the Jordan precedent. Yeah. Yes. Tell us what that is and why it's impactful here.
Jordan is a case where the Supreme Court of Canada changed the way the 11B right was interpreted by courts to try to make it clearer and easier to enforce and interpret. And what they did is they set basically maximum time periods for reasonable delay. For cases prosecuted in the Ontario Court of Justice, it's 18 months. In the Superior Court of Justice, it is 30 months. And that delay is focused on delay created by the state. And so delay created by the defense or by a unexpected event like an illness or something like that, you go to trial on the first day and the judge is ill, those delays don't count. But delay that is caused by the prosecution or congestion in the court system does count towards that time frame.
Let me ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, if he would, top of page 3, bring up this chart. And those of you here in the studio can see it on the monitors here. This is showing AI investment in Canada in fiscal year 2022. More than $1 billion invested in Ontario, $600 million in Quebec, roughly $250 million in each of BC and Alberta, and about $360 million for the rest of the country. So add it all up, we're at about $2.5 billion across the country. And yes, Ontario's well ahead of everybody else, but as the biggest province, you would expect that. Sanjana, I guess I want to know from you, are those numbers kind of where you think they ought to be?
I mean, ideally, it should be much higher than that. We would like to see much more investment in the ecosystem. And that is why we have, again, like Tom referred to, right? Like there's investments that are made in talent through the Pan-Canadian AI strategy, which was effectively a talent strategy for companies like, Cohere, Wabi, CentML, Untether, et cetera, to come out of the ecosystem. There have been investments made in generous tax credits that help companies be more capital efficient and move the money into other facets of the business, like go-to-market. Then you have venture capital investment that is required to put more money into the ecosystem and into founders such that they can scale. All of these combined are required to increase those numbers. And I actually think we were talking about entrepreneurs in the ecosystem and the American entrepreneurs, how they're different from the Canadian entrepreneurs. I think we all need to invest more and more into this ecosystem, because the more you invest in the ecosystem, the more founders come out. If they're successful, they exit, they reinvest their, experiences, their capital back into the ecosystem. And that's also the story of the founders of Radical, who launched a company, sold the company, reinvested that. And that's our hope with the companies that we invest in that are from the ecosystem. They grow, they scale, and there's a flywheel because they reinvest in the ecosystem, whether that's their own talent, experiences, as well as their financial capital.
Well, that does prompt a question for you, Ryan, which is, and we did a program about this actually a week or two ago, we don't seem to have the same appetite in this country for risk-taking and upfront investment in AI, venture capital, et cetera, obviously compared to the United States, but even compared to some of the other G7 countries where we should be more on a par, the thinking goes. Why is that?
Well, I understand that's a common perception. I don't think I can comment on the industry as a whole because I don't have that experience, but I could share, from my perspective, I've had slightly different experience. I have experienced some of the Canadian ecosystem at least taking risks on us and believing in us as an early stage company. But I guess what's interesting about that is, for example, the example I would give would be Techstars Toronto, which is an accelerator. The director is a guy called Sunil Sharma, and they took a risk, invested in us, and introduced us to the rest of the ecosystem. However, they are originally an American company, so they may. There you go. So it may be that Techstars Toronto embodied the spirit of the Valley, where they take risks on early stage companies. But it was through that we were introduced to other Canadian venture capitalists who did eventually take a risk on us as an early stage startup.
All right, Chris, I'll get you to comment on the same thing. You've seen this both from an American point of view and from a Canadian point of view. Why do we seem to be much less interested in taking those risks?
I think a big part is when you look at the size of the investments, it definitely takes a lot to compete at the highest levels here. Take chip development as an example. One chip might take 3+ years to develop, in excess of $100 million just to bring one product design to market. And so while the numbers on the prior chart may seem big, they're actually not in the context of actually what it takes to develop and compete at a global scale in AI. And I think one of the big elements of risk-taking is also the community of risk-taking. So we've gotten great backing from folks like Radical Ventures, Canadian Pension Fund, to have the foresight to have those long lead investments. But if you look at tech hubs, Silicon Valley, Singapore, Taiwan, you have that entrepreneurial spirit that feeds off each other. There's movement of people between companies. They support each other. And one of the biggest differentiators also isn't just the startup mentality, it's also the consumption. It's as your banking sector, your healthcare sector, your agricultural sector at the forefront of using and deploying the solutions that are being developed in your AI ecosystem. That's also that flywheel effect that starts kickstarting and feeding off each other, because then you want people going back and forth between big enterprise, small enterprise, to seed innovation, ideas, and experiences back and forth. And so it's not just the entrepreneurial startup risk taking; it has to be risk taking in your key sectors that can benefit from new technologies like AI. You need to be at the forefront of adoption to make it happen.
Let's talk about what's happening right now. You obviously saw that the United States Congress, some might say miraculously, passed a huge aid package for Ukraine, $60+ billion. You would understand this better than most. What impact can that amount of money and materiel have on this war?
Well, first and foremost, I think what Ukrainian and Western leaders will try to do is stop the bleeding, right? And I mean that literally and figuratively. Right now, Ukrainian forces are reporting that that Russian troops are making serious progress in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region, and they've been able to make much faster progress than they had been in weeks prior. And that's because the Ukrainians are, simply put, outgunned. They are firing a very small percentage in response in terms of artillery that the Russians are firing.
They don't want to run out of ammo.
They want to run out of ammo, and effectively, in many cases along the front lines, they have run out of ammo. So the first priority for them will be to stop the advance of Russian troops, because the Russian troops have the initiative right now. This is a logistics question. How does Ukraine get as much 155 millimeter artillery rounds right to the front lines as quickly as possible? That's the first step. But the second step is for the Ukrainian military and political leadership to develop a broader strategy of what does victory mean and how are we going to get from here to there. That's something that that they haven't been able to do because they haven't been able to understand what kind of tools, equipment, and resources they've been working with. So now the ball's back in their court. And the Zelensky administration and his generals, they're going to have a really tough task for defining what are we going to do over the next year? What are we going to? We've got this aid package. It's probably going to be the last aid package from the United States for the foreseeable future. How are we going to use this in the best possible way to get the aims that we want to achieve in the near term?
I still think people want to know what constitutes victory or defeat in this war. It's not going to be like we think of in a traditional World War II setting where they're going to meet in a train car and they're going to sign a document. And presumably at some point, somebody decides it's over. So apropos of your example there, how do we get from here to there?
Well, you ask 100 people, you'll get 100 different answers of what victory entails.
Right.
Some people will say that it means that Ukraine reclaims all of its territory, including Crimea. Others will say that it's a sort of just negotiation. One Ukrainian official said something really interesting, saying that he defined victory as being able to get onto an aircraft in Kyiv, a commercial flight in Kyiv, and fly to The Hague, where he would observe
war crimes
trials at the ICC. So two elements there: the resumption of normal economic activity and accountability for the atrocities during the full-scale invasion. The Zelensky administration has taken a very hard line, which is to say this war isn't over until we've reclaimed everything. I don't know if reality is going to set in and force him to change his tune on that.
Do you think that's just a negotiating position?
Well, I think it's likely. I mean, right now we have very, 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 very exhausted Ukrainian troops. They're going to need to make hard decisions like, are they going to mobilize hundreds of thousands of new soldiers, train them, and use them? But right now, the military situation, strictly speaking, because of the deadlock on the front lines right now and how slow progress is made, as well as how dug in Russian troops are, it's hard for you to see in the near term Ukraine reclaiming all of the territory that it had gained to date. Right now, what they have to do is stop the bleeding and then regain the initiative, and then they can have a conversation about how far can they go with that?
I don't know how often it's the case that a war between two countries and the outcome of that war is dependent on elections held in a third country. But that could be the case here. Biden versus Trump. Does the future of the war in Europe depend on who wins the American election this fall?
Not only the future of the war in Europe, but also what happens in the Indo-Pacific region. Right? Authoritarians all across the world are watching to see what the United States does, not only with the passage of aid to Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan, but also whether the United States decides to elect Donald Trump and heads in a more isolationist direction. The war in Ukraine is not just about the combat and the conflict in Eastern Europe. It's also part of an emerging Cold War between authoritarianism and democracy all around the world. It really does feel to me, I don't know if it feels like this to you, Steve, but it feels to me like we're entering a much more dangerous phase of global affairs. And
can I speak to that for a second? I grew up during the Cold War, when there were tens of thousands of nuclear missiles, Soviet and American, and we were right in the middle of the two of them. We knew that if World War III started, the missiles were going to go over Canada. But we always had, at least I always had the sense that there were sane people who were on either side of pushing the button. I don't get that sense here. I get the sense this thing could spiral out of control because nobody's sane in this one. Is that fair?
Well, I grew up in the sweet summer of the 1990s and a different kind of phase of geopolitics.
Yes.
So, it's a new and unexpected and unwelcome shock to me, but it really does feel. There are new rules, and they're being written right now. We don't know who's writing them, and they're being done in real time.
Next week on The Agenda.
The story of this book is a story of how we Europeans said, never again. We were never again going back to that hell. And here we are nearly 80 years later, and we're back in it.
That's next week on The Agenda.